Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webcast, Medical Affairs Engagement for Digital Interventions, Industry Perspectives and Lessons Learned. This is hosted by SSI Strategy and the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. I'm your moderator. Hi, my name is Rachel Killian. I'm part of the medical affairs team at SSI Strategy, which is a life sciences consulting firm that combines business acumen with medical and clinical disciplines, including medical affairs, clinical development, HEOR, and safety. I'm a molecular biologist by training, and one of my areas of expertise is digital interventions. Here is our agenda for today. Each panelist will introduce themselves. I'll give a quick minute to define what medical affairs is as our framework for today's discussion. Andy will give a quick overview of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance mission, and then we'll start our panel discussion. Okay, let's start with introductions. I'm joined by 5 amazing panelists. Besides being subject matter experts and tenured industry executives at the helm of successful companies, you all excel at the intangibles. And what I mean by that is I've had various levels interactions with all of you, some of you over many years and in multiple different medical affairs projects. And what I know is that you are all kind, thoughtful, perceptive, and gracious. And that's what makes you well respected within your companies and within this industry. So I'm very glad that you're here today. Thank you for making time in your schedules. And let's start with introductions from each of the panelists. Everett?
Sure, thanks. Really a real privilege to be here, especially among my co-panelists. I think it's just an incredible group of people here who will provide great insights for this discussion. So very much looking forward to it. I'm Everett Crosland. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Cognito Therapeutics. Cognito is a late-stage Alzheimer's company focused on neurodegeneration in Alzheimer's, as well as Parkinson's, MS, and other CNS diseases. So we are currently running our phase 3. Medical affairs, as well as real-world evidence and health economic evidence, is critical for our launch readiness, as well as company readiness and market shaping efforts that we're engaging in as early as this year and going into our launch in the coming years. So really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks so much for the time.
Great. Owen McCarthy, I'm the co-founder and president of MedRhythms. And at MedRhythms, we build digital therapeutics that focus on helping people improve their walking following a range of neurologic injury diseases, using the neuroscience of how music, and specifically rhythm, can target the auditory system in the brain and use that to move the human motor system. Our furthest along product is for patients with chronic stroke walking deficits, but we also have a pipeline that includes multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. Honored to be here today. Excited to interact with each of the panelists and talk about medical affairs. You know, in our organization, it's been core to what we've done since day one, including the overview of the science of what we're doing in helping people improve with rhythm. Before we even thought about building a product, our co-founder was out at medical conferences talking about that. And so excited to talk about that full journey with all of you today.
Hi, I'm Andy Molnar. I'm the CEO of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is the trade organization for this industry that we're talking about today. Owen didn't remember to mention that he is the chairman of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance board. Everett as well is on the board. But me personally, I felt when I first got into digital about 5 years ago, I asked the question, how do you e-prescribe an app? And nobody knew. And so I found that over time, working in government affairs, actually with Everett back in our pair days, and then working through commercialization strategy with Sharif at Cognoa, that I really cared a lot about the plumbing of this industry so that every company could be successful. And so almost 2 years ago now, I joined the Digital Therapeutics Alliance to continue some of those efforts that really hopefully resound for the industry and for all of these members to progress in a more simplified and streamlined path.
So if Andy's a plumber, I guess I'm an electrician. I think that is what I heard. So I'm Sharif Taraman. I am a pediatric neurologist as well as board certified in clinical informatics. I think I bring a little bit of a unique perspective. So I'm a former chief medical officer at Cognoa, but currently the chief executive officer. So hoping to bring some insights as to kind of how that changes based on your role, how you think about potentially medical affairs. For Cognoa, we are a digital health company initially focused on diagnostic. And we created the first diagnostic for autism ever evaluated and authorized by the FDA. But that way of developing diagnostics has also allowed us to think about not only pipeline expansion into other related neurodevelopmental conditions, but really understand how we can drive therapeutics home. And we have breakthrough status on a therapeutic device to treat core symptoms of autism.
Hi, I'm John Wagner. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Connexa. And the medical office at Connexa is basically accelerating evidence generation of the digital biomarkers and digital measures that Connexa works on. What Connexa does is implements and develops and implements digital biomarkers and measures for biopharmaceutical companies in clinical trials. Our customers are those companies who want to use digital biomarkers, and we do everything from scientific consulting through trial implementation to analysis.
Let's level set on what medical affairs encompasses. If you're not working in medical affairs, it can be a nebulous term. Even if you don't have a medical affairs department, chances are that your company is probably conducting medical affairs related activities, as we can see here in these 5 pillars. One of the great things about having a medical affairs team is that it serves as a hub for these activities, which allows for efficiencies internally and externally for a targeted, efficient, insightful approach to growth. Particularly with how unique digital interventions are, which we're going to learn more about from this panel in a minute, it is very important to work as an experienced team that can translate best practices from the industry to what is important for how unique each organization and product is, and own the scientific narrative behind your products. Now over to Andy to explain the mission of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance.
Hi, I'm Andy Molnar, the CEO of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. The Digital Therapeutics Alliance is a trade association of industry leaders and stakeholders engaged in the evidence-driven advancement of digital therapeutics. As the leading international organization of digital therapeutics, thought leadership, and education, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance provides policymakers, payers, clinicians, and patients with the necessary tools to evaluate and utilize DTX products. Our mission is to broaden the understanding, adoption, and integration of clinically evaluated digital therapeutics for patients, clinicians, payers, and policymakers through education, advocacy, and cross-industry collaboration. And our goal is to bring every stakeholder together that is looking to drive this industry forward, from the smallest of startups to innovators at educational institutions, all the way through to venture capital who fund these projects to get in the hands of patients. We define digital therapeutics as products, as software that treats, manages, or prevents disease or disorder. That definition will actually be updated shortly with ISO, the International Standards Organization, to be a little bit more streamlined across the world. What we look at are these core principles for how we define a digital therapeutic and what it needs to be considered a digital therapeutic, which specifically separates us from things like mobile health that you can download from the App Store. There are over 300,000 mobile health apps that you can download on the App Store. We only consider a small portion of them to be digital therapeutics. First of all, they have to study an endpoint in a clinical trial. They have to be patient-centric and engaging. They have to incorporate patient privacy and security protections, and they have to generate real-world data at every engagement, which creates real-world evidence, I think, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And with that, I just want to talk about our initiatives real quick. We are looking specifically to enable market pathways, which is a lot of reimbursement focus, work on Capitol Hill, which, as Rachel talked about, we'll be doing as a group for our first summit. We look to accelerate commercialization, which is to help companies figure out where they spend their resources. And we look to optimize real-world use, which is education of providers and patients so that they actually adopt these products quicker. So I'll end with our inaugural summit which Rachel already talked about. On June 6th, we're going to have our Advocacy on the Hill Day. that's a fly-in day. And if you're used to this from other trade organizations, we're going to bring at least 30 people around to different congressmen and women and talk about the importance of reimbursement and the Prescription Digital Therapeutic Act. And then from June 7th to 9th, we're going to bring stakeholders from all over the world to discuss where this industry is moving and how we solve for our biggest problems. This summit is going to be an actionable event where afterwards we're going to have a nice direction for how the DTA can help drive this industry forward over the next couple of years. Thank you. And I think we'll move on to the panel.
Great. Thank you all for introductions. Let's just dig into some questions. So the first one I'd love for you guys to all comment on is, what does medical affairs look like or involve at your respective companies, and what kind of value do you think it brings to your organization?
So medical affairs for us right now as a late stage clinical company is really dedicated to clinical trial recruitment, clinical trial design, as well as key partnerships with key opinion leaders and institutions that will validate our medical device that and the mechanism of action underlying our clinical outcomes. From the commercial perspective, we partner quite a bit with medical affairs to ensure that our clinical trials are designed in a way that yield outcomes that will be persuasive to the market, as well as partnering with them to ensure that we have a broad base of key opinion leaders that can help us today at the clinical stage, but also in the future when we're launching.
Maybe to build off that, I mean, I think the pieces that Everett mentioned, like we also have built at MedRhythms and think a lot about in terms of the right evidence to develop, running clinical trials, et cetera. We had just finished in the last 12 months our pivotal trial. And so we're now transitioning into the commercial phase with medical affairs and are starting to build out the teams that will be out there working with the physicians, et cetera, educating them on the science. And so are really transitioning from that clinical development into the commercial phase of medical affairs. And that's sort of what it looks like at our company. I will say that, like, from the early days, as I mentioned, we were evangelizing the science before we even knew that we were going to build a product. My co-founder was out there talking about it. He comes from a clinical background. And then every time we think about a new clinical program, we basically start with, okay, who's the top KOLs in this space? Can they help us figure out what the unmet need is? And then can they help us lay out the evidence generation strategy to make sure that we can be most efficient at reaching patients? And so that's maybe a year or so before we get into a new indication, we're starting to talk with the KOLs there to figure out what the right fit is to then move to where Everett's group is, and that's where we've been mostly, and then move into the commercial stage, which is where we're going.
I think there's probably a lot of parallels, at least in our digital world that we're operating into more traditional, either med device or pharmaceutical med affairs functions. The interesting thing is there's also a lot of unique perspectives. As much as there's a lot of excitement around things like, large language models like ChatGPT, the reality is that there's probably early adopters for that kind of technology, and then there's going to be laggards, and then there's going to be all the folks that are in between. And so as much as we are potentially influencing not only our respective maybe condition areas, so in my case, neuro, or Everett's case, neuro. Well, actually, everyone seems to be neuro focused here, which is great. I love it. But, if I had a cardiac device, for example, right, you have to get the cardiologist maybe on board. What we're actually doing here is really thinking about how do you drive clinician adoption or clinician perspectives around the digital part of it as well, which is interesting and different and in a very unique space. And so as much as our medical affairs is the science, the presenting at conferences, the finding the KOLs and early adopters within the condition or area of therapy or diagnosis, it's really also about the digital components. Another huge area that I think is probably within many of our medical affairs functions is the advocacy components, both on a government level, but also within the patient communities as well.
So at Connexa, medical affairs, in fact, the whole medical office is a newer addition. And we're really bringing the patient voice to Connexa. We've always been focused on the patient voice in collaboration with customers, but we're increasingly bringing that patient voice to the company, and then helping to align and educate the customer in a kind of a feedback loop as well. For Connexa, internally facing, we identify payer considerations and are a one-stop medical shop, if you will, and we're setting the stage for extending digital biomarkers outside of clinical trials throughout the healthcare system, which is a longer-term value proposition for the Connexa platform. For our customers, we're providing confidence around the economic advantages of the Connexa platform, and we're supporting payer data requirements. One other thing I wanted to mention is that we also have a more traditional medical affairs function. We call it the Connexa Academic Partnership Program, where we're partnering with academics to for implementation of our Connexa platform solutions, specifically in Parkinson's right now, getting it in the hands of investigators and increasing the exposure of academics to these kinds of digital measures.
That patient voice, I think, is extremely important. And as a med affairs function, understanding how to amplify the patient voice, engage the patients is always a great guiding North Star for us. I think for all of our companies, and really trying to identify how do you engage the patients and get them to be active parts of their medical care. It's interesting. So the space that I'm operating within is primarily the pediatric space. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics, as much as it's a specialty organization for pediatricians, really one of the main missions, actually as a board member myself for a local chapter, is really how do you bring the voice for the pediatric patients who can't necessarily speak for themselves. And so as a specialty organization, a lot of the med affairs work that we do is understanding how do we engage and make sure that we're aligned step and toe with the mission of the American Academy of Pediatrics to bring that voice for those children.
Sharif, it's a really interesting point. We have, I don't think it's as stark, but we have a similar challenge at Cognito where especially moderate Alzheimer's patients are far enough along to where their experience is difficult to ascertain directly. And so we think a lot about the caregiver voice or care partner voice, as well as how do we think about the caregiver and care partner burden. But it's an interesting point that you make about really incorporating that patient experience in when the patient may not have full capacity to really relay or convey what they're experiencing and how their journey is going.
Besides the patient voice themselves, we've also now had a lot of experience with the patient advocacy groups. Increasingly, rare diseases has become an area for Connexa, and as you know, those patient advocacy groups are incredibly important for getting holistically an idea for where patients are and where fields are moving.
So I'm going to oversimplify this, Rachel, so don't kill me. But when my members, because we have about 110 companies as part of the DTA, talk to me and they've never heard of medical affairs before and don't really know how to utilize it, I simplify it with what's your data strategy, which has to start as early as possible. How to use, and it's not just the clinical trial, right? It's your economic data, it's your real world evidence, things like that. How do you use that to build the right relationships and put the two of those together to have payers give you a positive coverage determination, providers actually want to prescribe or use your product in their office with their patients and have patients trust you. So if you think of everything that all the examples that this group has given so far, it's like a really clear to me way to put a plan together. Now, the hard part is what they're talking about, which is getting into the details of who's actually going to make that change. But from a clinical perspective, I think people forget. They think market access, you hire a market access person and you can maybe convert a payer. But it really comes down to those core principles, and you're talking usually doctor to doctor at that point.
I actually think you're spot on, Andy, and that simplification is exactly it. I think sometimes we don't realize we're doing medical affairs when we all are in various capacities, whether or not it's called medical or not. And so you guys touched on basically all of the pillars that make up medical affairs. So if we take just a step back, I want to ask you, when did you, whether you called it medical affairs or not, when did you start to engage in these activities? Where along in the product development were you? And when did you start to see some of these things come to fruition versus when you started those efforts?
Yeah, well, to jump in here and to connect that to what the conversation we're having, like I think, we all know, or at least I know now, I was doing med affairs from the beginning. At the beginning of the start of the company, it was really like, okay, how do we get the evidence to get this through the FDA and into patients' hands? We didn't necessarily call it medical affairs at the time. And so I think for those out there listening that are thinking about medical affairs as this fancy thing, right? It's this thing across the whole spectrum of development, and it's very helpful. And Andy helped to demystify it. In our case, it started day one. We were like, we know the science works. Well, how do we A, prove it, and then B, find a population that we can bring to that there's an unmet need, and then C, make an argument that someone should pay for it, right? And that was sort of the questions we were asking as entrepreneurs when we were starting the company. And I think I probably spent my first 6 to 12 months thinking about med affairs and then putting that in a pitch deck and telling a story to investors on how they should fund that work. We didn't have a full-time FTE on that. We had to learn on the fly. And I think, so for us, it was day one or day zero or whatever you'd like to call that.
Well, it sounds like, it sounds like it is, right? Med affairs is going to evolve over time, but making sure that you actually have a strategy around this is, I think, really important, because as simple as it may sound, to Andy's point, which is, the basics are there. There are a lot of complexities with it, and there's a lot of moving parts, and it will change and evolve over time. And so thinking about what are the stages, what do you need to make sure that you do early, so that when, to your point, Owen, right, you do it on day zero, and what you don't want to do is go back and be like, oh my goodness, I should have had some health economic data in my clinical trial because I know I need it now, and I don't want to run back and have to recollect that moving forward, right? So what are the things that you almost wish you did in medical affairs? Having a strategy around that is really important, because you don't want to be in a situation where you go, I wish I shoulda, coulda, woulda, when you actually had the opportunity to do it earlier.
Well, and even to just jump in there, right? There's a lot of traps in the early days you can fall into, particularly if you find people that want to ask really, really interesting academic clinical questions that could be super impactful in a 20-year time frame. But as you're building a company, right, it's hard to connect that to what you're just saying on how to get the right HUR data to get the payer to pay for it and get it into people's hands. And we had to learn that the hard way as we were trying to parse through people's advice on what to look at and what to study. But it's definitely some traps in those days also.
I would say that our medical affairs work is almost immediately beneficial to the company from, I guess, day zero, as others have said. One of the goals of Connexa is to sponsor our own clinical studies for evidence generation. One of the earliest went from concept to start in just 5 months, and that medical affairs input really drove that really accelerated pathway, both from KOL input and endpoint refinement through the protocol development and eventually implementation. Other aspects will take longer. That evidence needs to be generated, and our customers and potential customers are really craving that evidence, because we're transitioning from early adopters and innovation groups in biopharmaceutical companies to clinical project teams, written large, and that they demand the evidence, and that evidence has to be generated.
Well, I think the nice thing about medical too is that kind of bridges what the clinical is needed, what scientific is needed, and then ultimately like what commercial and AGOR needs, so that you find those commonalities so you can be very efficient about what do you need now versus what could be cool 20 years down the road or where you'd like to be. So I think having someone, sometimes it's not even a full person, an N of half is sometimes all you need when you're starting, and then growing from there to connect the dots or connect all of the different pieces that you've got moving. I will shift gears. You guys, again, touching on everything of different pieces, but I think, Owen, it was you mentioned, or Andy, about how KOL engagement not only, shapes clinical efforts, but that it also plays an important role in shaping payer decisions. So in light of, the news about our colleagues and friends at Pear, their team cited that payers was one of the major challenges that they faced. And so just want to know, how are you approaching things differently, or lessons learned there?
I'll jump in. I mean, definitely unfortunate news about Pear, right? Like we can all admit that. As we think about across at our company and across the industry, right, there's a lot of commonalities there, but there's a lot of differences across companies, including mechanisms of action and competitive set and even reimbursement mechanisms that people are undertaking and going after. And so I think the Pear story is definitely one of an early trailblazer that got out there and helped knock down some doors, left us some directions that we all can aim at, but also one that's not going to be the fate of everyone, because I think, even if you look at us, we have hardware as part of our product. We may have different reimbursement pathways we can go down. Our relationships with payers might be slightly different. You look at others, they say, look, employers are our main target, and we know how to get uptake from them, and they can do that. And so I think, it's a little more complicated than the evidence needed for payers, et cetera, because there are some structural issues. But I think we can learn a lot from them, and people are having successes around them. And so I think, I'm thankful that they were out there, and sad that it had to end this way.
I think, Owen, you're touching on something that's really important. I think, to maybe a point I made earlier, maybe when you're in the CMO seat, right, you're hyper-focused on how do I create evidence generation? How do I bring, the stuff that supports the payers? In a different seat right now as CEO, I'm looking at, hey, how does this all stitch together from a strategy perspective, right? And I think if you really sit down and you go, okay, how do we, dissect this post-mortem? Sorry to be that grim as a physician, but, honestly, it's a lot about how do you stitch all of this together, right? So my advice to anybody is, if you're doing med affairs in a silo, you're going to fail. You've got to figure out how to get your med affairs and your commercial and your, all your other functions talking together and stitched together in a very strategic way, so that you're also timing things at the right point, right? I think, for example, if we look at what happened at Pear, right, one of the things that I would argue, and I think is a good lessons for all of us, is, you do actually have to show commercial traction and payment before you decide to jump into a public market, or, some other vehicle to that extent. So you've got to have enough bandwidth and runway to get through some of the long arc, because the reality is healthcare is complicated. Having been a clinician, I've fought with the insurance companies on that side of the house as well. And it's not easy, right? It's a long arc to really get them to say, okay, this is something that we do agree with. And, from a med affairs strategy, thinking about how do you get others to also, echo your voice, I think is really important. I'm fortunate, at least in the autism space, that there's laws that mandate coverage for both diagnosis and treatment. So, thinking about how do we leverage that is going to be important for me. On the flip side, for you all, right, thinking about how do you, again, to maybe John's point, how do you advocate from an advocacy perspective, because, if Connexus goes out in the world and says, oh, you really need this, it's a much different conversation than, the Parkinson's group saying, hey, this is something that we need as patients or we need as physicians, right? So how do you bring that together? I think is going to be essential to really show adoption, show that commercial traction, and make sure that your Med Affairs is successful.
I'd just like to jump in here and say, I think as entrepreneurs, it's really hard to believe that the timeline and the financials needed to really collect the proper data for people to make coverage determinations is difficult. I mean, you want to bring your products to market as quickly as possible, and you don't start a company with this idea that it's going to take 2 or 3 years to collect data, right? And so when you think about items like real world evidence, you can only do that after you have your product in the real world. So how do you get there faster? But how do you make sure you have the resources for that and the timing before your company, can really blow up? And so I just wanted to add that piece in that sort of looks at the contrast between what we want to happen versus how the healthcare industry works in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think the learnings from Pear really is that they were creating a market, and then that market continues to be created and evolve as others carry the same torch. But creating a market is a long, arduous, costly process that requires just mountains and mountains of evidence, as well as that slugging it out to drive demand as well. And I think as Owen said, there are a number of us and that have recognized that we're not necessarily in need of creating a market. We will be selling novel products into an existing market with existing reimbursement pathways. And so that path is less long, less arduous than just creating a market de novo. At the same time, there is a need for digital therapeutics. There's a need for the democratization of healthcare afforded by digital therapeutics. And that need is recognized in multiple different disease states. And it'll just take time. And I firmly believe that in the coming years, we'll see Pear's vision or some iteration thereof bear out. It's just a matter of, in some sense, Pear running out of time, because that is a very, very long and costly process. So we all owe a real debt of gratitude to all their work there. But at the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for many companies to realize those markets that are already standing right in front of them that they can scale into. That's certainly what we're doing at Cognito as a medical device, with hardware that will be predominantly in the Medicare population. And we know that CMS has a need for disease-modifying therapeutics in Alzheimer's.
I wanted to extend the conversation on advocacy groups for a second. Besides advocacy groups, there's these adjacent areas, consortia, cross-stakeholder kinds of efforts that really are related ultimately to payer acceptance of innovation. We work with, at Connexa, we work with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, but increasingly expanding outside of that advocacy kind of an avenue, also to the Critical Path Initiative and the FNIH's AMP-PD are also opportunities, the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for Parkinson's disease. And I think that those consortia kinds of efforts really shouldn't be ignored, because they end up becoming areas where there's an exchange across different kinds of stakeholders and helps drive adoption.
Can I pick up something real quick, actually, Rachel? Everett was talking about that time piece, and we kind of we talked about it a little bit, but I think it's important to maybe emphasize it. So the time is so important, and I would really emphasize, and I think all of us have experienced this. you've got to get it right. You've got to get the right endpoints. And a lot of times, as subject matter experts and people who are really leading the charge, we actually have the opportunity to define what the endpoints are, and do some education to regulatory bodies is that this is the endpoint that really is the one that matters for patients. And I think that that's really important, and that can drive completion or execution of a clinical trial. There's a lot of efforts where also thinking about distributed trials rather than the more traditional trials to get to execution faster and trial completion, innovative recruitment strategies. And the beauty is that as much as we are, maybe disruptors or innovators in the space, at some point in the, I think, very near future, the reality is that digital therapeutics are just therapeutics and digital diagnostics are just diagnostics, because the reality is that everything is becoming digitized, right? I don't order non-digital EEGs and non-digital MRIs, and I don't give like a lot of the neuromodulation is huge, right? Like these are areas that we're seeing that are just now treatments in neurologic disorders, right? And understanding that it's not just all about biologics anymore. It is the way of the world, and it is what is going to happen as we move forward.
Actually, Sharif, you touch on kind of something interesting around there with there's additional education that has to be done to payers, to KOLs, really to the field in general of the education and the messaging about what is digital, what questions should they be asking, and then also think a bit from kind of a risk mitigation strategy of this is the scientific messaging. What are kind of like some risk mitigation strategies, or how do you meet that educational need on all those fronts kind of proactively?
Interestingly enough, I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. Going back to maybe Andy's point, like you can simplify things, right? So AI can be complicated or complex, but it doesn't have to be. One good analogy that I use is most clinicians don't fully understand, for example, how an MRI works, right? We're spinning protons with magnets and to different energy states and relaxing. Most people don't know how that works, but they understand and trust that when I get an MRI, if I see a tumor or I see a lesion, I understand that that's MS. That's, maybe some of the cognitive stuff that we see in dementias, right? You have signal there. So they need to know that the science is there, but they may not need to fully understand it. We do have the benefit of, things like artificial intelligence becoming more ubiquitous within our societies and within our clinical practices as clinicians. And in fact, actually, there's an entire workshop, for example, this coming week at the Pediatric Academic Societies that one of my colleagues is giving, Dr. Chang, on. It's a workshop for researchers on AI. I think it's like 2 hours. And so, again, a lot of that is becoming more mainstream. So, yes, there are components that, you have to educate for us, for example, in the autism space. There is some questions that you're going to get around what is this digital stuff? What is this AI stuff that you're talking about? But at the end of the day, as long as the science is solid, you don't necessarily need to overcomplicate it, but you do need to address it and have, thoughtfulness about it. And there's advantages actually too. So can you communicate the advantages of digital, right? And I think a big one is actually accessibility. We talk about equity and we talk about, justice in healthcare and accessibility. And there are some digital divides that we have to address. But at the end of the day, I would argue greater than not, our digital solutions that all of us are working on actually increase accessibility and address a lot of the ethnic, racial, or socioeconomic status biases that occur in healthcare that actually cause significant changes or differences in outcomes of those who have versus those who have not.
Maybe on the theme of simplification, Sharif, I think it's a great point. And I think on the flip side of this, as manufacturers, just because we can do something with technology for clinicians doesn't mean we should, right? And so we need to really understand their workflows and not overburden them with new information that's unnecessary and those other things, because I think sometimes as technologists, we get really excited about what we can do and overlook the fact that that's not at the heart of why they would care about our products. And so I think simplification goes in both directions. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah, to also jump on the simplification theme, I spend a lot of my time educating along the lines of simplification. And just as Sharif stated, the digital isn't that different. And one of the powers of digital biomarkers is the power of repeat measures. Digital measures allow those repeat measures to be taken, but the data is not that different than what the in clinic kinds of assessments are. So, take for example mobile spirometry. It's an FEV1 is an FEV1 whether it's done in the clinic or at home. But the at home can obviously be done much more frequently than coming into the clinic. And explaining that to folks is actually, I think, a big role for medical affairs.
Well, and I would argue too, John, that your FEV at home actually may be more accurate and representative, because your FEV in the clinic, I may have been running in there to get there, and there's environmental exposures potentially in the clinic or not that are not realistically there, and so do you actually get this higher resolution data? And I would argue that that's across the digital spectrum. And I'm going to do a dig quickly on a neurologist because I am one, but I can tell you when I check reflexes, I'm very subjective in my reflexive, grading of reflexes. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to obtain more reproducible, less subjective, more objective, more representative information across the spectrum by leveraging digital technologies. And again, in a non-complicated, simplistic way, it ultimately improves everything that we're doing within healthcare. And that message within medical affairs, I think, is exceedingly important.
I want to circle back on, Sharif, one of the comments that you made earlier about, well, actually all of you said that you saw the output from your medical affairs efforts almost immediately, and that's music to my ears. I wish I could say that that's the case with all efforts that you do, but sometimes, Sharif, as you mentioned, getting the right endpoints or engaging the right advocacy groups or payers sometimes even in study designs too can take time. You're doing those initial efforts and the output does take some time to do it right. So just curious as a little bit of kind of level setting of how long for some of those longer projects, how do we level set of, yes, you are making the effort upfront, and when did you start to see those results? And are you still seeing results from those early efforts too, kind of coming to fruition?
Well, I'm going to just toot my own horn for a second. So I think I did it in a really smart way, which is, to your point, I think you actually mentioned it too, Rachel, is, you don't necessarily need an FTE to do some of this function. And actually having some flexibility in partial FTEs, I think is exceedingly important. And so early medical affairs work at Cognoa was actually done within this dynamic, I need this at this time and I can swap this out, this resource for that resource. And so sometimes partnerships actually can help you move very quickly within a med affairs function, especially when you're first getting it established. And I think that that's actually really beneficial because, again, to your point, it's dynamic and it changes over time. And so you have to have a degree of flexibility so that you're not sort of stuck with one thing in the early stages. But they are long arcing. And again, you start at day zero and your med affairs function actually never finishes. Even when you're super successful in the commercial space, you need med affairs function to stay ahead of potentially competitors that are going to be follow-ons that are inevitably going to come and try and do a 510K to your de novo or whatever it is.
I think your med affairs team, as you scale commercially, would be one of your core value drivers as it expands your label, as it acquires data to allow for label expansion, as it's also a key source of market insights about what matters most to physicians, what matters most to KOLs, what matters most to the physician MDs and HCPs at payers as well. And so, yeah, I think just to echo what Sharif was saying, you really see med affairs kind of evolving into a core value driver that's beyond just clinical design and beyond informing the medical affairs strategy, and truly a core partner to commercialization and label expansion.
Yeah, I love what you guys are saying because it can be really daunting to young companies. If you go out and get a quote for med affairs work, or you think about the people that you're going to have to hire, and you look at the 200 things on a launch playbook or something that you have to do, the cost is in the millions. But you can start with a publication strategy when you know your endpoints. You can plan a lot of this ahead of time and really do that with in a more scrappy manner with lesser resources, especially if you choose your resources wisely. So I kind of love hearing that, where you can consider how to phase into it, especially if you start at day zero, like you guys all said earlier.
And as I hate to say this, that we're coming up on the end of our time, I'd like to go around the virtual room with all of you. Is just anything that we haven't touched on yet. Best practices, things you wish you knew earlier, advice to give on as you think about your medical affairs strategy.
Well, I can start. I was just going to jump in the last conversation. I think one piece of one reflection I've had is the importance of expectation setting, and setting appropriate expectations for medical affairs, and then of course delivering on those expectations. They can't be unattainable. To a point Andy made, it's if your expectation is to write an abstract or to write a paper, you have to then go and deliver on that on the appropriate timeline. So I think laying out a timeline of reasonable expectations is a big piece of how to deliver a good medical affairs strategy.
Agreed. The one point that maybe we didn't touch on as profoundly are the bridges between health econ and med affairs. And those come in a variety of forms, but I think we've talked about the importance of medical affairs not existing and driving in a silo. Where I think about in a late stage clinical stage company, I really think about those bridges between health econ and med affairs, the bridges between market access and medical affairs, and then ultimately market shaping, even just the marketing messaging and how we're positioning product and company in a evidence-based way. Each one of those pivotal moments requires just hand-in-hand partnership with med affairs across those bridges.
I would also just add to that, as much as med affairs has significant external facing elements to it, there's actually a lot of internal facing. It's, helping drive lexicon within the organization. It's about messaging within the organization. It's education within the organization. I think, we do what we call lunch and learns, where med affairs will present something or our data scientists will present something, right? So there's internal education that actually happens as well. And so, I would say what we've learned in this meeting is start early, be strategic, be thoughtful, don't be siloed, simplify.
I was just going to add, I think one of the hardest parts about building relationships is, and we didn't really talk about this, is to always have an ask, right? So you can talk to patient advocacy groups and they can love you. And it could be a year out from when you're going to launch. If you have nothing to say, this is what we need from you, or this is what we need you to do, then they'll say, great. And they'll get off the phone and they won't think about you. And a year later, they'll be like, oh, you're back. Okay, cool. What do you want to talk about now? So it's really important. And it's always expected, when you talk to these different people, because sometimes it can feel uncomfortable to have an ask. When you talk to a KOL, say, if they're the payer KOL, make sure you say, we're going to want you to talk to your payer contacts for us. Are you okay with that? You don't want to find out 2 years later that you had a KOL that is not going to talk to their payer contacts for you, because that does nothing for anybody. So I just think that's a good point that we didn't really touch on too much. Sorry, Owen.
No, all good. I think I want to pull from the bridge concept and the silo concept that Everett had the bridge, Sharif had the silo, and say that another bridge that has been really important to us is between med affairs and product development, particularly as it relates to the patients and the patient unmet needs, right? Our product development team runs a sort of an ongoing clinical trial process that we call Product Lab that really helps us refine how to build the product. But in that process, we continue to learn more and more about the patient, their condition, their setting, their unmet needs. And that really helps on the med affairs side be able to frame up like, who we're talking about and who is useful for the product. So I think that's another bridge. I think in digital therapeutics, one of the learnings you'll find is where things might be clear in other industries, where there's the delineations between the lines of things, it all just kind of mashes together. And there's a lot of interdisciplinary circles that get built that are really important if we want to serve the patients and the clinicians and the people that need our products.
So Owen's organized his organizational structure in cortical columns, with the third layer being the cross communication between the cortical columns. That's what I heard.
Sharif asked me to send my org structure a few weeks ago, and it looks just like that. So,
Exactly.
Neuroscience nerds.
Oh, well, thank you guys. Well, we're in good company. You guys have been an amazing, very honest and thoughtful group, as I suspected. And so I want to thank you again for your time and your lessons learned about being strategic, being meaningful, and engaging early. And we'll all look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in Washington, D.C. for the DTA's first inaugural conference in June. And thank you again, all of you, for your time today.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for watching and thank the panelists again for their time in this engaging discussion. All of our companies will be attending the inaugural DTA conference in Washington, D.C., and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation in person. Hope to see you all there.